Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Windows on the World. This is a special broadcast. We actually have changed our broadcasting to YouTube. We do our Sunday show now at windowsontheworld.net. Please subscribe to us on Spreaker, where our Sunday shows originate. And we also use Odyssey as a platform. All the information is in the last couple of videos I've put out. And also, to make it easier, go to windowsontheworld.net. It's all on the homepage. And the reasons that we're not using YouTube for our rather controversial and fact-filled Sunday shows is all explained. Most people who listen to the show will know that. Today, we're going to have a bit of a change. We're going to talk about ancient Australia, our origins, and the origins of those previously on the planet. Stephen and Evan Strong have been looking into this for many years, and they've found and actually curated many anomalous artifacts, which are very puzzling in the timeline of what is called conventional history. And I'm with Stephen today, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that, plus more. Do have a look at our previous interviews on Forgotten Origins with Stephen and Evan. Their website is forgottenorigins.com. And over the years, I've been fascinated by what's been going on down under, because it does rewrite our conventional view of history. So, Stephen, welcome.
Thank you for having us on, Mark. Once again, always a pleasure. And unfortunately, as you know, Evan's a bit destroyed at the moment, so he's laying in a lounge somewhere trying to stay awake. So it'll just be me today.
Yeah, well, we haven't spoken for over a year. And the last time we spoke, we were actually discussing the finding of two skulls, which really redefine our position in conventional history. Could you just explain what happened with these two skulls? Because they came into your possession, or you were able to kind of look at these skulls and you had models made of them, which yes. I think you actually showed me last time. So go into a bit of that first, because people may not be familiar with that at all, and it's a major find.
It is a major find, and I'm pleased to acknowledge that the government's aware of that too, because they've sent me a lot of literature, albeit always threats, but they've at least acknowledged the fact it's there. What we've actually found are 4 sites in Australia where a skull was found of the same type on each occasion. Now, what we've managed to do is I've been on site, the one site that is complete, a complete skeleton, and another where 8 bones were given to me from the skull. Now, what we managed to do with those 8 bones is we worked with 2 experts in Australia. One worked for the Australian Museum, and the other one is the person who does the set designs for Alien and Predator, all the monsters there, which is an unusual combination. And what we got out of it was a remake of a skull that's not like any that are found on this planet anywhere. The major considerations with that skull, to sum it up very quickly, are that number 1, when you get to the forehead, which is here, the eyebrows, there's nothing. It doesn't go any further. In fact, you would swear this has got to be duller than Lucy if you just looked at it from face-to-face level. But when you look behind the eyebrows, you find this massive skull flasking backwards and running behind the eyes, so that about 95% of the brain matter would be at least level with or below the eye level, which is not how our skull is formed. And what's really interesting is that it doesn't sort of go like ours, which is in the middle, it's a bit wider, then sort of flares, then runs back a bit. This one keeps running backwards and backwards and backwards, and starts at around about 12 centimeters and goes out to 17 right at the back. So it's more like a flask than it is actually our skull. In fact, it's nothing like the shape of our skull. The cranium capacity's got to be at least 400 cc greater than a Homo sapiens skull. The eyes are massive by comparison. We have a skull of a Homo sapiens and we measured the 2, and the eyes are 46% bigger. The nose is much different to ours. It starts about here and shoots straight out, and it has a different shape to a normal Homo sapien nose. In fact, every piece of this skull is dramatically different to what we've got today. Now, just adding to that, on the site I was on, which I got a lovely letter from the government about, and 46 questions to answer, and a threat for 3 years in jail and $500,000 fine. But we'll leave that for now.
Stephen, I just want to interject there so you can explain that, and maybe also go into what the situation is with finding artifacts in Australia and the government reaction, because maybe a lot of people aren't aware of that. We've talked about that over the years. I'm fully aware, but maybe you could explain that to the listeners and actually where the skulls were found, if you want to go into that.
Yeah, look, two of the sets of skulls were found on the Murray River, close to it, about 300 k's apart. Another one is in the desert in South Australia, and one is down in Victoria. Now, the reason that I've got 3 different sets of threats, one about the skull that we went to that was in situ, on site and complete, and the other ones is because these skulls, ladies and gentlemen, they don't even have 3 sutures. And all hominids have 3 sutures, as we know, and that's how Lucy gets to what we are today, because when we're born, the sutures aren't set, and therefore there's give and take there. Well, these don't have that. They really are not. They're not terrestrial, honestly, they're not. So the government have basically got me in a situation at the moment where legally I do have the bones in my house. They've given me permission to do that, but they have not given me permission to take it outside the front door and be analysed. If either of those things still happen, I'll be taken to court, and they'll try and put me in jail for 3 years and fine me. So that's the situation in Australia. It's been that way for quite some time. I got an earlier letter from a different site, the Standing Stone site. It's par for the course in this country. This is a country that really does not...
Maybe people aren't familiar with the Standing Stones site, and maybe people out there aren't familiar with there being standing stones in Australia, so maybe you should inform them on that as well.
I've opened a Pandora's box here. That's 184 standing stones. Some weigh 10 tonne, and they were on a farm, and that farmer was told by his father to destroy them, and he let me go on that site and let us do archaeology on that site, and we then found the stones that were there, and they did weigh about 10 tonne, some about 5 tonne, and there was 184 that stood on a mound and a 45-degree hill to get them up, and the technology to get them onto the top of that site today, if we were to put them back, it would cost us millions upon millions of dollars to get the most sophisticated machinery to stand them on the site they are on. And they've been there for perhaps 40,000 years. That becomes a problem for the Australian government because the original people are supposed to have had a stick, stone and bone technology only until Cook comes. So we have an issue with that one for that reason. So I got into trouble for that. The reason I was getting into trouble for this one was for a combination of reasons, but mainly because everything about this skull was ridiculously different. I mean, I saw a tooth there, which has been taken off me. Otherwise, I would have gone to jail for that one. It was given to me by the elders. And it's got 3 roots, and they all curve outwards like that. They don't go straight down to be pulled out like ours is. It's amazing. They're curved outwards, 3-rooted only. We didn't find 2 or 4s, just 3s. Nothing about this skull is human. And as I'm going to mention before, the most amazing part wasn't even the skull. It was a humerus bone, which was laying in the ground there. Because we didn't dig down, because if I dug down one inch, I wouldn't be talking now. I would be in jail. They watched us so carefully. And that's that humerus bone. Ours is about 30, 31, 32 for a basketball player, 35 for a gibbon. Well, the one I picked up and measured went all the way down past this part and went to about here. But I didn't find the ankle. I didn't find the elbow joint. It was broken. And I measured 43 at that stage. Now, what was amazing about that particular bone, this amazingly long arms, is the widest part of the bone was 1 inch. Now, here you have the largest humerus bone on the planet. And I've seen the gibbons one, and it's thick, because it's carrying all the muscle and it's carrying nothing. It's a useless appendage. And then you put together the fact the eyes are so large they couldn't come out in the daylight, and you start to wonder yourself, what have I got here? I've got a being that has an arm that's not functional on this planet. The gravity we have is too strong for it to be functional. Now, if it was half the gravity, well, that's different. Then it could work, but not at this level. And then I've got a being that's got eyes so big it couldn't come out in the daylight. Now, if we was living in space at half the gravity, all that makes sense to me. But none of this makes sense to me if it's just something that's come from nature. Now, if you found one of these on its own, call it a mutation. If you find 300 kilometers away, call it a double mutation. But what if I find two in two other states, one in Victoria and one in South Australia, and the one in South Australia is 2,000 k's away and the one in Victoria is about 500? It's not a mutation, it's a species. And the species has a brain that's bigger than Denisovan, bigger than everything else, any other Homo that's ever existed. All of them, much bigger than Neanderthal, bigger than Homo heidelbergensis. All of them put together don't come close to this one. But it's got no forehead. It all goes backwards, which means it has a different neck. It has a different arm. It's just not from here. And it doesn't have 3 sutures. And that's the point that both.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a point I wanted to make just before I forget, that the Paracas skulls found in Peru, in the Paracas region, those that appear to be naturally elongated have 2 sutures rather than 3. Are you aware of any of those?
Yeah, I am, and there are some similarities because I've said that one of the ones we've got, the one that's been a rebuild on, it certainly doesn't have a back suture, and they all made an issue of that. Now, what they did was they decided where the first crack was, that could be a suture. And they went with that, but I picked this up straight away and I rang them up and they agreed that the sutures here are in a completely different alignment to the ones on all sapiens and hominids, are in a different position. These ones are on the descent, way on the descent and further back than they should be. So we just think it's a crack there. It's not actually where the skull is broken. We think it's either got 2 or none. But of course, the elongated skulls, as you know, taper. These do the opposite. They start at 12 and continually get larger. So the largest point right at the back is round about just there. And there is no tapering. The back of it is just like this. It just goes like that. It doesn't taper back at all. It just goes like this and then runs back. Unfortunately, I have them upstairs, but take my word for it, there are pictures up. And as you know, Mark, we've put it up on our website. So people
ForgottenOrigin.com, ForgottenOrigin.com. It's all on.
And there's a lot of articles on them, so it won't be hard to find it. We have it as just one full category. And you'll find there are 4. And the problem with those things is because of the fact they just don't fit into any description of anything we've got. I do not believe they're a hominid, and I have had the top scientist in this country look at these skulls before he was banned from looking at them anymore. And the first thing he said when he looked at him, he said, "My God, that is not a Homo sapien." I said to him, "But only Homo sapiens ever came to Australia, according to your theory. Is that not correct?" To which he said, "Yes, it is correct." Well, it obviously isn't. So at the very least, the whole story of how Australia was populated by African Homo sapiens is incorrect, simply because, and by the way, I do know the burial site for one of these sites is at a place where the Murray River was last running past 60,000 years ago. And it's on the side of a bank, and there are quite a few other skulls there. And this particular skull, the one we're talking about, had its arms crossed and its knees brought up to its arms, and it was facing east. And it had red ochre on it, and the bottom 2 teeth were taken out, which is the same ceremony that takes place in that place just until Cook came. So this was not a mutated being, was buried with respect. It was covered in red ochre, which is still on the skull, and we have it outside, so I know it's there. And it is not a Homo sapien, nor is it a hominid. So my belief is it is a Pleiadian. It's that simple, simply because of the fact the anatomical features do not belong to this Earth, but they would belong to a place with less sun and less gravity.
It's very interesting, Stephen. Yeah, fascinating, because the late Lloyd Pye introduced this idea called intervention theory. I didn't agree with his take on the Zecharia Sitchin kind of angle because I was never convinced with Sitchin's work. But the whole idea of intervention theory and the timelines of which he talked make absolute sense. And we are not adapted to this planet at the present time. So It is a very interesting question as to where we were adapted to in the first place, or were we, Homo sapiens sapiens, merely genetically modified to be subservient and not quite as clever as those who genetically modified us. Now, that is a huge problem to not only creationists, but also people who talk of intelligent design. So you tend then to fall somewhere in the middle of creationism and intelligent design, which goes back into biblical ideas of the Nephilim and all this stuff. Now, I don't really want to get into that because there's so many people speculating about it, but the genetic modification does make sense. However, these different types of hominids are completely anomalous. And they are not reported. This is the main issue. They are not reported and they fall out of the mainstream. So therefore, we still have Darwin's theory of evolution being taught in schools. You still go into the Natural History Museum and see this ridiculous pantomime of us basically changing from this creature called Lucy, who was just found little bits of something, and they put it together. And they said, this is what we used to look like, and now we look like this. Well, I'm afraid that isn't good enough, because the evidence is all out there. And you have been maligned by the government, as anybody is. Anything outside the controlled narrative of public opinion is demonized. We live in a system which is communitarian, and people will rather laugh at you than actually listen. Because if it's outside their experience, it doesn't exist. And this, to me, is one of the dichotomies, because why have the human race become so dumbed down? This is a question which I cannot answer. I think we brought it up before, but it still perplexes me. And it's obviously a matter of great frustration to you. Maybe you'd just like to give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Mark. Why have we been dumbed down so much? Actually, I can answer that to an extent with the other skull that was given to me with the one that we put back together. Now, that particular skull, instead of having a 6 millimeter width around the skull, measured 15. And it had a massive forehead, an incredibly large forehead. And we had that looked at by the experts too, the same people who put the first one together. And my suspicion, Mark, was it was a Denisovan. Because as you probably know, the race on this planet that has the largest amount of Denisovan are the Australian Aboriginal people. In fact, I'm 4.7% Denisovan, which is a living example of that link. So my thinking was, because this skull looks so different from the first one, yet they were buried next to one another, or close to one another, I should say. And I was handed both of them. And to my surprise, they both the gentleman that worked for the Australian Museum doing the skulls and the gentleman who made the models for Alien and Predator, both said it's not Denisovan. What you have here is an archaic Homo sapien, not sapien, but an archaic Homo sapien that's only ever been found in Africa. And that was a big shock to me. And then I thought to myself, isn't it interesting how it's found next to this other thing that's not from here at all? Yet they're virtually next to one another. And at the site where it was buried, the one that's buried, next to that one, we had a robust individual that had 14 millimeters thickness brain skull. And what we found out is the square knob on the back, when I reported this to a scientist, says, oh, that's the standard markings of the Neanderthal. So what we tend to find here is it's not just those two skulls, but the skulls buried alongside, and by the way, that site's been closed down by the Australian government, according to the experts, and I had no idea what the square knob on the back was, but I saw it and thought, that looks odd, because it was 1.5 centimetres by 1.5 centimetres at the back, and it was like a pure square. It was only when this gentleman pulled out a book and showed me the back of a Neanderthal, I thought, that's it. So what have we got there? Next to these two things that don't fit, we have a Neanderthal and a Homo sapien archaic. That tells me that they were all interbreeding and mixing together. And I make a point about this often, Mark. I say to people, and I put up a picture of a zebra, and I ask people what it is, and they say it's a zebra. Then I put up a picture of a chimp, and they all say it's a chimp. And what I say is these things all look basically the same. And then I say to them, what shall I put up as a picture of a human? Well, they could be 40 kilos, they could be 400 kilos, they could be 2 feet, they could be 7, they could be 8 feet high, they could have red hair, they could have every possible hair you could have. In fact, you could have 7 billion of them and no two look the same. And you're trying to tell me that we have the same shared mother as the chimps. Well, all the chimps look roughly the same. So do the gorillas, so do the orangutans. We'll put a human face there and we're not part of this. And like you said, that insult of Darwin is disproved by the fact there are 7 billion people, and you and I don't look the same, Mark, and no one's ever going to say we do. But if there were 3 chimps in the room, we'd have to pick it out and work it. Oh, I think this one looks a little bit different, but not like you.
The sort of standard answer to that, Stephen, is that we look all the same to them, you know. But I think the thing is that this is what endlessly fascinates me. That because we're not adapted to the planet, because we need clothes, because our joints wear out, because chimps are between 5 and 10 times stronger than us and can rip us to pieces, why do we think we evolved from them when they're adapted to the planet and we're not?
Yeah. And they've got a sagittal keel and we've got sutures. We're trying to tell us the same mother and father made us both. Well, what happened with our heads? It doesn't make sense, and we know it doesn't make sense, but unfortunately in these days, Mark, that's not enough to change mainstream thinking, because common sense is not part of this anymore.
Not at all. It's called controlling the narrative, and it's something that I cover on all of my shows, the way we're being socially engineered, because if we as a species are allowing ourselves by our own consent to be socially engineered and lied to, what does it tell you about us? And this is a constant problem. And I think we are in a very defining times at the moment with this global action plan, which is being rolled out on the back of a pandemic, which is a psychological warfare exercise and a depopulation program. There's no doubt about that. This goes into very big questions as to whether there is an off-planetary influence. I mean, well, I don't think that's something we have time to go into today, but it's something that I've looked into in the past, certainly, and I think we've mentioned it before. Well, maybe we should kind of move on now to some of the more recent things that have been found, and maybe give a little bit of a background as to how these artifacts came to you in the first place. Because a few years ago, we were talking about these rocks, and they belonged to a lady called Roz, and they had these very deep striations on. And there was a story that because they didn't fit in with the Australian timeline, that they'd been somehow brought from Africa and dropped there, which is kind of typical of academia. So maybe you could go into that for a little while.
Yeah, well, we now have hundreds of these rocks that have been marked and striated in ways that you can't use with a stick stone bone technology, where you need 4,000 degrees heat, where you basically need the finest blades imaginable to cut them. We have so many of them now, it's not even a debatable point. That's just part of the fact. What we're looking at and what we find there is the technology involved in some of the rocks we've got. And as I said, they do run into the hundreds now. I mean, the Smithsonian said about the first rock, it's unique in the world. Well, that was an understatement. And they did offer to take it off me, but for some strange reason, I ran the other way. I never spoke to them again. But we'll leave that alone. But yes, we have come upon in Australia technology that doesn't fit. And what we've now found is that, by the way, those rocks are in the process of being placed on country forever. They will never go in a museum. They're going to an original culture centre, which I can't talk about at the moment, and they'll be laid on the ground in sacred formation, and people can sit inside them if they wish and get the energy which is definitely there. That's all good. That's part of what we're doing with that part of the equation. And yeah, they don't fit. But most definitely the rings, of which I can tell you now, of the 9 we've got, the statues and rings we've got.
Stephen, maybe you should kind of expand on that to the viewer, because they might not be familiar with what you're talking about.
Right. We have 9 different artifacts that are found, 4 in Australia and 5 overseas in different places. These rings have come in a drip feed order. And to begin with, it started with a ring that was found at a place called Hill End in New South Wales, Australia. A gentleman dug down 1.5 metres and found a metal ring in Australia. Well, that shouldn't happen. In Australia, the original people had a stick stone bone technology, so it shouldn't be there. But it was. And he got it analysed. Look, it looked like gold. But when the analysis came back, it said no gold found, and it said it was made of primarily copper and zinc and trace elements of nickel, iron, and lead. Now, that's not gold, and therefore he put it up on the market, and Roz bought it, the same lady who bought all our rocks. And she told me one day I bought a ring. And I said, well, that's really interesting. And, of course, I had no interest in it. And she said, it's quite amazing. It decides it wants to be with you, so I've sent it down. And she did. And it sat on my cupboard for about 3.5 months. And I looked last occasion, look at it and say, 2 paragraphs. 1, what's a metal ring doing in Australia? And to go down that far, it's got to have been there for about 40,000 years. That's my 2 paragraphs. I had nothing else to say. And for 3.5 months, I didn't do a thing. Then Roz rang me up a couple of times and said, what's going on with the ring? Oh, I'm about to get to it. But I never did. And then one day I decided I would. And I had the metal readout. It was quite an unusual one. And I punched it into the computer and asked the computer, what does it mean? Well, the computer told me it meant nothing because I couldn't get one paper in the world that had these 5 elements together. And there was only one readout I got, and every time I searched, which was the word Wikipedia. Now, Mark, I don't know why, but for reasons I don't fully understand, I didn't want to go there. I wanted to go anywhere but there, but in the end I did out of desperation. And lo and behold, there it is. It's called orichalcum. And in the Wikipedia entry, it says orichalcum is a mythical metal that was found in the mythical continent of Atlantis. I thought, well, that's a bit different. I didn't expect that. I thought it was some form of gold or brass, but no, that's what it said. But the strange part with Wikipedia, Mark, is down below it had a picture of orichalcum. And it said it was found in Sicily in a shipwreck, a Roman shipwreck, 6th century BC. And I thought to myself, hang on, if it's mythical up in that sentence, but there's a picture of it, Wikipedia's got a problem with their fact check there because it can't be mythical and then a photograph of it. So I looked at that and I looked at the readout and it said above 75% copper, below 20% zinc, and 5% lead, nickel, and iron. I thought, okay, fine, that's orichalcum. Then I looked at my readout and I noticed something quite amazing, mate. I had the same 5 elements, but not the same 5 percentages. My copper was below 75%. My zinc was 25%. And my 3 trace elements made up less than 0.5% together. It was 99.5% zinc and copper, but all the rest was 95, and the other parts were 5%, and this was 0.5%. I thought to myself, well, this is orichalcum too. And then I read what Plato said and what Pliny the Elder said about orichalcum, and what Homer said when he wrote a poem about Aphrodite, dedicating orichalcum to her as her metal. I'm thinking, well, geez, the ancients believed in it. So what we did is we decided, okay, there could be something in that. So this is how it began. She bought that ring. Then she bought another ring from Lemuria, which I'm going to hold one up in a second. And she got that one, and it was completely different. And it's massive, Mark, and I will hold up the one I've got, which is like that. And you might see where the finger fits on it. This is not a normal finger. And you'll notice as you look there, there's an ape on one side fully done up in armor, and I'll spin it around for you. On this side, you'll see an elephant, and above it is a pig, all in armor. It's quite a magnificent piece of work. Now, what happened was, I won't go into all the details for this, how we got this one. I started rubbing it. And I thought, my God, that looks the same as ring number 1. And we got this one analysed, and lo and behold, it had 5 elements in there, and guess what? They were exactly the same 5. But there was a difference. Well, this one, which was found in Angkor Wat, so was Roz's, the one she's got. She's got one like this with the elephants and the monkeys, but not the pigs. They were both found in Angkor Wat, and both of them had the orichalcum symbol, signature. But this is where it starts to get interesting, Mark, because what I found is we now have 3 Atlantean rings. And the reason why I call them Atlantean is because on the first ring, not only does it have the hint of orichalcum, there were 2 symbols on them. And the same 2 symbols are on the third ring, which I'm holding up now. And the first symbol happened to be the Berber motif for Atlas, the son of Poseidon. And
That's
the
really
second
interesting,
symbol,
Stephen. Sorry to interject there, but the Berbers have a very fascinating history. They embraced Islam at some point, but when you look at their architecture and their clothing and their culture, it's very fascinating and also kind of not really very represented. And this is something I've found as well, which is interesting, in that there are elements of many, many cultures which are just not explored. And the historical timeline we are given doesn't fit. For instance, if you go to places like Nepal, you won't see anything which is from before really the 14th or 13th century, when Hinduism really got into the culture. The Hindu culture is very ancient, obviously, but everything seems to be from one period. And once you go into places like Upper Mustang, you get these caves, which we use for burial, which are totally anomalous. And most places in the world have these anomalies, which just cannot be explained. And I think that's really what I find so fascinating about your work. It's interesting that you mentioned Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is meant to be edited by members of the public, but it has its own editors. I mean, I've been slandered on there, and I haven't even got a Wikipedia page. People have set them up to slander me and say it's a deleted Wikipedia page with all of these links on that have nothing to do with me. So Wikipedia, in my opinion, is not a credible source of anything. And of course, it controls the narrative on really what the accepted corridor of opinion is. And anything outside of that is demonized as possibly right-wing or a conspiracy theory, as we know. So it is interesting, all that. I mean, the Atlantean stuff is a kind of catch-all in some ways for a lot of things that are anomalous. But it takes us back into another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, really, is that the Pangaea theory, because obviously that would affect what happened with Australia. In other words, that we did have this borderless mass of land which was smashed to pieces through catastrophes and comets. And that makes absolute sense. And that's something that I've looked into. Maybe you could pick it up from there. I don't quite know where I was going with that statement, but I'm sure you'll kind of pick it up. Yeah.
I can, and I know where you're going with this, because what I'm trying to say is that the Angkor Wat stuff we found at Angkor Wat and the stuff we found in Hill End was at a time when this was all one supercontinent. That's the first thing we found out with this. What we also found out was this, that these types of rings had the copper, the zinc, they had the lead, they had the nickel and the iron, but I found that a lot of people spoke about the fact they could never find the Orichalcum mine. There wasn't an Orichalcum mine. What we found was this, some amazing synchronicity in the chemistry of these readouts. And I want to share a few with you, that I found that with the 3 Atlantean rings, which, by the way, the 2 other rings have 5 circles there with straight lines above and below, which I think represents the 5 inner circles of Atlantis, with the Atlas thing on both sides. Now, 1 and 2, basically 1 and 3 have those symbols, 5 and 4 on both of them. And the second symbol just has the symbol of Atlas alone. So that may well have been his ring. What we did find was this. All Atlantean rings obey the very same rules. All are around 99.5% copper and zinc, and then 0.5% of the 3 trace elements. But when you go to the Lemurian rings or Pangaean rings, there are some major differences. And if I can share with you a couple of them. And it tells me this was an alchemist that made all these rings. It was never a place that was digging this ore out. It doesn't exist. It was made. And this is what we found. When we went to the Lemurian rings that were found at Angkor Wat, and I'm going to come up to the major one at the finish, which breaks every rule, but we'll get there slowly. We found in the first ring, there was an abnormal amount of lead. In all the other rings, both Atlantean and Lemurian, the lead is beneath 1%. On this one, it was 8.6%. So that what happened was that changed something. There was no nickel in this one. Instead, they put in titanium. Now, Mark, there's a problem with titanium in a ring that is thousands and thousands of years old, because we only first used titanium in any manufacture in 1932 to harden 24 karat gold. Before that, we never used it. So my question, and by the way, it has the hardest density to strength ratio of any metal on the planet. That is why the titanium was put in there instead of the nickel, because the lead would have weakened the structure of that particular ring. So the alchemists knew that and put that in. But this is where it starts to become interesting, because when you go to the third ring, which has a Dharma wheel around it. Now that one's fascinating, because like the second ring, the one I held up, it has 99.53% copper and zinc. Both of them do. But the zinc in the second one is 38%. And in this one, it's 19%. But they added up exactly the same in their combination. Now, what we also found with all of these rings from Lemuria is another metal is added to the orichalcum. It's tin. Now, in this one here, it's 1.12%. In number 3, it is 1.12%. I got to see this time after time after time where they did exactly the same thing. In fact, in Atlantis number 1 and number 3, the nickel in there, in the first one is 0.121%, and in the third one is 0.120%. And I started to look at this time after time and said, hang on for a sec, I'm getting so many mismatches that come out the same number in total, and then I'm getting things repeated time after time. Now, because the third ring had such a large content of zinc, they needed a hardener again, but they didn't use titanium, that's been used once. They used chromium, which happens to be the second best density to strength ratio of any metal and second best hardener. So I'm seeing a pattern there in these rings where, okay, but remember, the chemicals I'm talking about were discovered in the 1804 or past that, every one of them. So I'm looking at what's taking place in the Lemurian rings, and I'm seeing more sophistication in chemistry than I am with the rings from Atlantis, because there's a standard. 2 big ones, 3 small ones each time. Here they're playing around. And then we come up to the piece de resistance, which I will hold up, which is this ring here. Now this ring is completely different. It has no copper, no zinc, no nickel, and no lead at all. But it was found next to this one at Angkor Wat. They were found together. And Roz bought this one first. Oh, hang on, this one. Oh, God, I tried to get this right. Bought that one first. Then this one would have turned up about 5 months later when the website reappeared, because it disappeared after this one and came up. So she bought this one next. And this one is absolutely breaks every rule. What does it have? All right, the largest reading on the most sophisticated electronic machine in Australia that reads this out, that is a 6-figure amount, and we get it for free, and I won't tell you how that happens. That's our secret. Its readout is the largest mineral content in this is 41.8%, not on this planet. That's how it begins. 41.8% cannot be identified on the periodic table, does not exist. What comes next? There's some iron. The third one is gallium, 8.69%. Now, if you want to go anywhere on this planet and just dig gallium out, you can't do it. Even Wikipedia acknowledges this. It's a byproduct. You can get it out of iron, you can get it out of aluminium, and you can melt it out around 4,000 degrees and you might get 0.1%. This is 8.69%. It is a byproduct that needs the highest technology imaginable to gather it, and you can't dig it out of the ground. So this is found, this has been broken 3 times. It's got to be 10,000 years old. It is so fragile, you drop it on the ground, it's broken. It is super glued together. It's been broken on 3 different occasions since I've got it. Once by Roz's husband, and we were going to call it the ring that David broke. That was Roz's husband. Then my son broke it, so it became the ring that David and Evan broke it. Then my wife broke it, so it became the ring that David, Dell, and Evan broke, because it is so fragile. But what else is in there? Well, we have palladium, we have rhodium, we have rhodinium, we have cadmium, which is used for batteries. We have all these metals, all 5 of those ones I just read out, and others I've forgotten, All of them were found since 1804, but they're all in there. Now, what do these things do? They're for catalytic converters. They're for solar diodes. They're for electronic things. And this is in a ring. And 41.8% of it isn't identified. Yet it is at least 10,000 years old. Now, I want to show you something else with this ring. If I put my finger inside, there is something you'll see with these rings from Lemuria that repeats itself. They're for fingers, but I can tell you now, when I put them on my fingers, they swing. And this one here weighs over 100 grams. And when you put it on your finger, what it does is that, because it's too heavy. And if you rest it on your finger for a period of time, your finger will hurt. So this is what we found, that thousands upon thousands of years ago, there's an alchemist that knew of at least 7 different elements that we didn't discover till 1804. Not only knew of them, but knew how you would approach each one of them and use them in relation to others. Now, what this ring is about, because 41.8% doesn't exist on this planet, well, look at the design, and I'll let you fill in the gaps if you wish. Now, I can tell you, people might say, what are you talking about? 41.8% not from here. Well, I'm going to hold up another object that we found at Carryong, this one here, which was analysed not by electronic machine, but by a laboratory, and you might see the cut on it just there, that shiny bit. The laboratory, which was in a university and has 38 scientists there, they work there full time, the head of this and analysed this one, and 24.1% of it is not on this planet too. So what we're getting in Australia, and this was found in Australia, that one was found in Angkor Wat, what we're getting here, ladies and gentlemen, is chemistry that we would be flat out emulating today, but it's thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years and associated through symbols to Atlantis, and in this case, through burial at Angkor Wat. And of course, as you know, Angkor Wat has massive doors for Asian people that don't grow 12 foot high. But if you are wearing this ring, or maybe wearing this ring, maybe you might be taller. And maybe there might be different sorts of people there. So that seems to be, and ladies and gentlemen, as I've said at the start of this, all of the rings we've got have been analysed. And notice we've used two different forms here. Top laboratory in the country and the top machine in the country. One was using chemistry, where they analysed it and broke it down. The other was using electronics. So you can argue one form is incorrect, but we've got 2 different forms. And with the rings, we've analysed every one of them by the same machine each time. So there's a consistency in the readout. You can't contest it, because on every occasion we went to the same place and the readouts were similar. So what we find from this, Mark, is that, man, the whole of our history, it's all in front of me right now as I look at it. These things I've got in front of me right now that I've shown you, they tell us that there were chemists alive tens of thousands of years ago. If we're going to call it Lemuria, Pangaea, I don't really care what the name is. What I'm finding is that with the exception of one ring, every one of these things were found at either Angkor Wat or Australia. And I think they're all together. And I believe the things that were made for Atlantis were made at the same place the Lemurian ones were made, by the same alchemist. And I can tell you now, that man must have had an IQ of about 4,000.
It's really fascinating, this, Stephen, because it's not stuff that I was particularly familiar with. And someone just put in chat, I don't know whether you could respond to this, that maybe they weren't rings, maybe they were just put on staffs, like ceremonial staffs or something like that. Do you think there could be for anything else? Is that possible, do you think?
That particular comment, I don't know who that gentleman is, but man, I've got to tell you something. That is stunning, and I'll tell you why. Because look, when I do this, Mark, I'm going to be honest, I do science first, but I also take psychics onto country. I do that when I go onto country because I do believe there's magic there too. But I make sure when I write I've written articles about the magic of these rings, but I keep them separate from the science. But what I can tell you is this. According to all of the psychics I've spoken to, these Atlantean rings were worn, I'll hold it up there, they were worn in the court and they were placed on staffs. This is what I've been told. And when they were carried, and 2 were carried to Australia, they were carried on staffs according to both of these psychics because they could not touch them because it would kill them. And by the way, I know that's true with these rings because I've done some dealings with that. We're not doing that today, but we're just going to stay with the science. But I've got to tell whoever that person is, you are very clever because I've actually written that, but I'm sure they don't know that. I'm sure they haven't checked that article out. But I have made mention of the fact the rings had to be carried on staffs because outside the people who worn them, no one else, whether it's true or not, the people believed if you touch those rings properly, you couldn't touch them. You couldn't put them on your finger. I mean, it's going to sound a bit Tolkien-esque, but the belief is if you put it on your finger, the magic overtakes the person who wears it. So therefore, you don't put it on.
That's a brilliant point, actually,
gentleman,
and I think that's something worth just kind of talking about for a minute, because having seen some of these ceremonies in Asia, people actually do get possessed when they put these masks on. They do mask festivals, and I was at one of them a couple of years ago, and it had to be shut down because somebody got basically taken over by something negative or something happened, and the whole festival had to be shut down. But what I saw was when people put these masks on, whether it's part of the acting out of the ceremony, they do become in a very heightened state. And there was a lot of fights there. There was a lot of things kicking off. And this thing about objects actually containing an essence and magic is something that I've been into a very long time, by the way, because I've had experience of it since I've been very young. People tend to call this psychometry. In other words, that these objects hold some kind of energy. Well, in actual fact, it's not that far-fetched to think that they would. It's kind of very obvious to me that if something is very historic, then it can contain an essence, and everything is made out of an essence. I believe in a lot of this stuff like etheric energy. The Victorians just called it the ether. I think that was actually a perfect description of the energetic field. We're getting a bit off the subject here, but maybe that's a good way of kind of bringing that back into something. That's really fascinating, Stephen, because I wasn't really aware of that stuff. I haven't looked at your site for a while. I've been traveling, and I'm finding that when I've looked at it today, that I'm very impressed with the way that you're dealing with it and the opposition you've had and what's been written about you. I obviously never take any notice of. But it's kind of funny because the same thing's been written about me. And I've had to block a few people today. I keep an eye on it, but it's. I mean, someone put in a comment saying, "So we're from outer space, are we?" I said, "Not necessarily. No, that's not really what we're saying. We're not. There seems to be this kind of." I think the ancient aliens thing has kind of ruined a lot of these arguments in a way, because it's kind of cartooned it. So it becomes kind of what if? Well, what if isn't really what is. It's a kind of endless cycle which takes you nowhere, which is a bit like what conventional timelines and history does. It doesn't really take you anywhere. And the way that history is taught is incredibly fragmented, very confusing. And when we find these artifacts, I mean, what you've shown me today, it's just kicked off another kind of realm of possibilities and wonder, and also confusion in a way as to what the hell we're really doing here. Because to arrive at this point where we're about to be genocided by what's being called a pandemic, and people are walking around with these nappies on their faces and they're not looking at any evidence. And we've got the elderly people in this country queuing up for an untested potion, which is not going to protect them from the illness in which they are in fear of. It's absolutely amazing. So I think we're at a very defining point in history, and hopefully intelligence might survive. And that is my only kind of final point here. I'd like you to finish off with anything you want to talk about that you'd like the viewer to kind of listen to or go to the website about.
There is one thing I'd like to talk about, and I think your lead-in runs into this perfectly. I fully get what you're saying. I'll try and make this, I'm not going to be too specific about it because it does push the boundaries a bit, but I am going to share something with you. There was a ceremony that took place at Uluru on the 21st of December. I'm sure you're aware of, Mark. And we're going to make some rather major claims about the fact that what it offers
Maybe
is
we
an
should just
alternative.
explain this and set it up a bit for our listeners who may not be familiar with this. It was a ceremonial event which was also attended by people from some sort of New Age conference, which you weren't really affiliated with, but it was a part of the event.
It wasn't part of the event. Yeah, actually.
Okay, right.
Yeah, actually, I've got to make a point there because people
make a point. Yeah, because I'm not very clear on this, Steve.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, a lot of people attacked them and said they were appropriating from this ceremony. They put that ceremony on and booked it 18 months before. They didn't know the grand conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn and the solstice was on at the same time, nor did they know anything about the ceremony the elders were doing at Uluru. It was coincidental, okay? And what actually the ceremony was about, they believed that there was something within Uluru that could heal the planet. And we've got an online conference, which I think is called OurAlienAncestry.net. And in it, we've been talking about it. We did 7 of those before, and we're doing the first one after about what happened at this ceremony and whether it's actually real. Our job is to bring in empirical evidence, which we have to prove it actually did take place. But the notion was this. It's supposed to be, and I'm going to make it very brief because I know we're sort of running out of time here and I don't want to get too far into this. The Mayans talk about the 2 roads that we can choose to walk on, which is what's happening right now. Honestly, we can see it in front of us. The Hopi, and we put this prophecy into one of our most recent articles, talk about a fast-flowing river that people must jump into, and if they stay on the shore, they won't be part of it. It's about a division between the people within this planet, about which way they want to go and where they want to go from that point. Now, the story is that on that date at 7:32, if enough people were meditating around the world, Uluru would be activated. Now, we spent a whole year trying to get people involved, and the conservative count was that 15 million people were meditating at 7:32 and sending positive energy. Now, we said all the way through, Mark, every time I spoke about it, I gave a disclaimer and said, I'm not convinced this is going to happen because scientifically it doesn't make sense to me. And it still doesn't. I said that every time. Even the day before at that presentation, I said to people I wasn't sure it was going to happen. So all the way through, and I give credit to all the people who jumped on board and decided to meditate when I was saying it's a maybe. Well, what we found out is, and I won't go into a lot of detail now, is I honestly believe that what's happening in COVID is meant to happen. And what happened at that ceremony gives people an escape clause, a way out of this mess. Now, I'm going to be cryptic about that and say that if you want to come along and join that, an online conference we're going to bring in 3 of the most important elders in this country. Are going to talk about basically how we should be living our lifestyle with this change they believe is going to happen, which you can invest in or not. It doesn't really matter. They're very interesting speakers. They talk old way anyway. And then we're bringing in 2 psychics, 2 women who are not original because everyone else is, to balance that out. They're going to give their take on what happened to them on the 21st of December. What I can say, Mark, is that we believe we have some absolute proof that at 7:22, Uluru exploded in energy. And the reason I'm saying that is we have film of it. We have absolute proof because we have film of it. We know that at 7:30, the Schumann resonance was running around at 0.3. And we know at 7:32, it jumped up to 32, which is an increase of 100-fold. And it stayed that way for the next 4 hours, then went back down again. Which tells me that maybe if humans started giving out positive energy to this planet, it may heal it anyway. And I made that point from the start. Maybe we'll do it ourselves. Well, something happened then. But what we also have is amazing film and photographs, and particular, a 1.5 second flash of light that shoots out of Uluru in every possible direction but doesn't go into the rock at 7:32, filmed by people who said, I never saw it with my eyes, but saw it in the camera. So, and we've got a lot of other evidence that's come in. And the reason I'm suggesting people might find this interesting is if this evidence gels with you, in this time of despair and hope, it gives you a way out, a reason for going through this, and an understanding that what's happening now is the wheat and the chaff are being sorted out. If those people want to follow these people down this road of subservience and being jabbed every year and nanoparticles being thrown into themselves, if they want to go down that road, that's their right. I don't argue that point. But that's going to lead, according to the Hopi, they'll be the ones who stay on the shore. Now, the Hopis say the hour has come. They've told you to go back home to your family, to your neighborhood, check your water. We have a large prophecy that we've put up from them because they sum it up perfectly. And they tell you to jump into this river and celebrate with the people who are there. So we believe, amongst all the science we've given you today, that there is actually science and evidence that proves that something happened at Uluru, according to the elders, that could change this planet. Now, when I first heard about this years ago, I was told a certain number had to be meditating on that day. Well, we exceeded that number tenfold. There was a massive amount of people meditating, and the stories we've got. That amazing picture, you might want to have a look at it, Mark, from Croatia. And 732 of this golden orb of light, cylinder of light going into the sky, and there's like a cylinder of like a flying saucer. I don't know what it is. It looks a lot like
Stephen. Yes, I looked at that this morning.
Yeah. Well, that one was at 732 at Croatia. And remember, 2 days later, Croatia had the largest earthquake it's ever had. Don't tell me that's a coincidence. We feel that was a UFO putting energy into the planet at the same time as what was happening in Uluru when the energy was coming out. So what we can show you on our online conference is empirical evidence. And I remember, even when I did the ceremony for 400 people at Uluru, and I conducted that particular ceremony. And even though I knew it was a success, and I'll explain more on the day when we do this, I still thought to myself when I came away, well, how am I going to prove that to anyone? And within minutes after saying that, the Croatia picture came in. And then we heard about the explosion of energy. And the next day, the Ukraine University, the people from there sent us the reading of the Schumann resonance. And then it poured in, Mark. It just kept coming in. We now have literally about 60 photographs, but we're not going to put them out at once. So far, we've put out 6, and we're going to put another 3 out on the online conference, then another 3, and we'll keep drip feeding people. And then after a while, we'll start putting in some testimonies of people. But that will be only after we've put out so much empirical evidence that people can look at the testimonies and say, well, look, I'm not going to question it now because something did happen. Now, I don't know how far it's going to take this. I don't know if it's going to go to what they say, and I'll talk about that more in the conference, but I would suggest to people who are despairing, you might want to come along and look at the conference and look at what we've got to say and look at the evidence and say to yourself, is that possible? Because I'm going to tell you now, I can see what's wrong with this place, but outside what happened at Uluru, I can't see an escape clause. I think we're being bought and sold. They're going to manipulate us. They're going to put things inside us. They're going to control us. They want us to become walking zombies that work, sleep, consume, and stay locked up inside. That will suit them down to the ground, and that's what they want to do. This is about the opposite. And this also has within it the fact that when these roads separate, one eventually disappears, and that's the lower road. And in that lower road, it's going to be a very full group. There'll be the cabal. There'll be a lot of people in that road. In fact, I'm told the majority of the people on that planet will be on that road. So maybe in this time of conflagration and chaos and fear, absolute fear, you've got to ask yourself one question, ladies and gentlemen. Do you want to live in a world where you're scared of the air you breathe? Because that's what they're offering you. And if that's what you want to live in, well, maybe that's your destiny, and maybe you won't be here for long. Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I can tell you something. Something happened at Uluru, and after that, you've got to fill in the gaps. But I would like to close with that because you raised a very important point. The world is being terrorized. I think, and by the way, I can tell you, we have absolute evidence that the Northern Territory government, I'll say this now, and Jetstar, our largest airline, domestic airline, were involved directly in trying to create fear within the ceremony we held at Uluru. and did something that involved the police, and they were all involved in doing things that you wouldn't believe. I actually told another group this and they could not believe, but we've got actually that letter they put out and gave to every member at that conference and scared the crap out of all of them. They thought 40 police were coming tomorrow. They thought all sorts of things were going to happen. And the next day that everything the government and Jetstar said, they lied about and they changed it all. So something happened there. Uluru was closed down for 2 days, the first time ever, without any explanation given. On the 21st and 22nd, no explanation given for it. I know what they were doing. And maybe people might want to come along and listen to this, because I seriously believe this is the last chance we have to save ourselves. Oh my God, that's a Muse song. Sorry, I just quoted from Muse. I shouldn't have done that.
That's great, Stephen, actually, because it sums up what I've been saying for a long time, that there are indeed two paths, and
Yes.
people who are voluntarily going down this path, which is what they are being coerced into doing, really by their own consent. This is all about consent. Consent has to be manufactured, or people have to be coerced.
Yes.
People are being coerced in a very diabolical kind of way, but it's still their choice.
It is
your
their choice,
choice, whether
yes,
you
it
sell
is.
your soul. It's your choice at the end of the day. And the strength of personality and the integrity of the person is what is actually at stake.
Yes.
The phrase "know thyself" is the most important one of all, and one of the most abused phrases around. And I think that's probably a good place to close. I think that was really fascinating, Stephen, packed full of information. People may want to have a think about that and look at forgottenorigin.com. This does run along with the bigger picture of what we talk about every week when we talk about the geopolitical struggle that's going on and the control and management of the human population as cattle, which is actually what is being imposed. However, this is a choice, and if you know yourself, if you know where you're from and know who you are and what you are, it takes a long time. None of us have the answer to that. None of us have a copyright on the truth, and I think you brought that up. But we have brought this up before, Stephen, and even a year and a half ago, before COVID, I think when we last spoke, we spoke about the same thing, that the paths are opening up. Which path do you take? It's your choice. So I think that's a great place to leave it. I hope Evan recovers because he hasn't showed his face today. He got stranded due to COVID, and thanks, it's been really brilliant.
My pleasure, Mark, and as always, a great joy to talk to you, mate. I appreciate the chance to do so. Thank you so much for asking us on.
Thanks, Stephen. We'll do it again very soon. We won't leave it for as long. We're doing a lot of these streams, by the way, on YouTube. We're going to keep the YouTube channel for stuff like this. Our Sunday shows will go out at windowsontheworld.net at 9:30 p.m. UK time, and they originate on Spreaker, so please do subscribe on Spreaker. We have to come off YouTube because we've had community strikes. We've had lots of videos removed. It's only a matter of time before they pull the channel, so we need to keep our more controversial stuff off YouTube. Today's been fairly controversial, but I think we should actually be okay with community standards with what we've said. All right, then. So thanks a lot, Stephen, and I'll speak to you very soon.
Thank you, mate. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
That's great. I'll be in touch. Thanks a lot,
okay,
Stephen.
Mate. Thanks for that. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. That was great. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. It was quite an early stream today, and it was really because of 3 different time zones that we're trying to juggle ourselves around. I'll be back with more of these, and we'll be putting out a lot of the stuff on YouTube. These kind of live streams will go live on YouTube. I'll be sticking to Odyssey, which is our new destination of choice. We will put our Sunday shows, we will put them on Odyssey. This goes out on Odyssey, our whole YouTube channel, all our content, 450 videos, something like that, is all available still on YouTube, which is why I didn't want to get the YouTube channel pulled, because we'll lose lots and lots of content, which I'll never be able to put up again. But just want to say hello to Alma. And yes, I'm still playing the Heretics of London soundtrack. You can purchase the soundtrack for our forthcoming film, which was composed by Alma Ryan, available at windowsontheworld.net. you can get it on iTunes, the link there, or you can get a limited edition CD from the source, the creator of the soundtrack, along, of course, with the luminaries, the musicians who did it. So that film will be out soon. I know I keep saying that, but we have had a lot of holdups, and not all of it's been COVID related. So that's it from this broadcast. Thanks to Stephen Strong for joining us. It was absolutely brilliant. I was blown away with some of that information. None of us have got copyright on the truth. None of us know empirically everything, and we're all still learning. So that's it. I think that's the kind of message for today. Thanks a lot, everybody, and goodbye.